Hi, Ozzy here. In recent days there have been a lot of videos and live Google Hangouts devoted to discussing the barbaric acts of terrorism perpetrated in Paris at the offices of Charlie Hebdo magazine, where 12 people were killed by some Islamic fundamentalists. One such hangout was devoted to how or whether religious moderates contribute to the problem of religious fundamentalism. We have to ask ourselves, do religious moderates provide, in the words of Sam Harris, luxurious cover for fundamentalism through their efforts to legitimize the discourse of faith? Now, to ask this question is not the same as alleging that religious moderates are to blame for the actions of fundamentalists. No, rather it's to ask if the sorts of things religious moderates say and do when they seek to ensure that their own moderate beliefs are treated with respect have the effect of creating a climate in which one must show equal deference to the views of fundamentalists. In other words, are moderates, when they seek to insulate their own moderate views from the outrage we would direct at fundamentalists, and when striving to legitimize their own moderate views, are they inadvertently providing legitimacy to fundamentalism? Now, in my view, many, but not all moderates do in fact provide cover for fundamentalism. And their arguments often serve to blunt the points and the edges of our assaults on fundamentalism, even when the moderates are themselves quick to condemn the extreme actions taken by some fundamentalists. Many moderates inadvertently undermine the efforts of secularists and non-believers to delegitimize fundamentalism. And this is because, for most secularists and non-believers, the problem with fundamentalism is just a special case, a more extreme case, of the liabilities of a faith-based outlook on the world. We secularists and skeptics and non-believers are, broadly speaking, striving to delegitimize the entire discourse of faith, including the beliefs of religious moderates. And many moderates seek to preserve and maintain legitimacy for religious faith, at least their own moderate versions of those faiths. And thus they have an interest in undermining our attempts at undermining the discourse of faith itself. Now, there's a whole lot to be said on this issue, but in this video I want to concentrate on just two ways that this happens as I've seen it played out recently in the wake of the Charlie Hebdo terrorist attacks in Paris. The first way is the tendency to blame victims. Time and again we're told that the cartoonists who contributed to Charlie Hebdo were being irresponsible or deliberately provocative. For instance, a moderate Christian of Protestant persuasion recently posted the following in response to my resharing of a Google Plus post. There were cartoons depicting Mohammed, which had been published by Charlie Hebdo magazine. In response to this, he wrote, and I'm quoting here, "I'm sure your post will bring great comfort to those in France today who suffered as a predictable consequence of such irresponsible actions." End quote. The irresponsible actions being referred to there are not those of the murderers, but of the cartoonists. Now, I hasten to add that this particular gentleman, after I accused him of blaming the victims, went on to qualify by saying the following, quote, "It isn't victim blaming at all. The responsibility for these actions lies full and square on those who carried out the atrocities. However, that does not make the speech," that is the cartoons depicting Muhammad, "that is, it does not make the speech responsible any more than it would if I approached a buxom blonde accompanied by her partner and expressed my appreciation for her boobs and my desire to have sex with her, followed by being hooked, that is, punched, by her partner." End quote. Now, I'm grateful that this particular Christian apologist recognizes the distinction between causal responsibility and moral responsibility or moral culpability. But that only makes saying such a thing even more perplexing. While moderates will typically insist that the blame for such acts falls squarely on the shoulders of the murderers, they nevertheless harp on how imprudent and injudicious and irresponsible the cartoonists were for drawing things which they had to know would generate outrage and offend the moral sensibilities of fanatical Muslims. It's certainly true that the cartoonists at Charlie Hebdo knew what they were doing, knew that their work would be taken as offensive by many people, and so knew the risks they were taking. Indeed, many of them lived under protection, and special measures were taken so as to make it difficult for someone to find their way into the offices where they worked. But does this fact, that they were taking a calculated risk, in any way imply that they're morally culpable for their own murders? Yes, their actions were causal contributors to their deaths, but one might as well blame police officers for being killed in the line of duty because they knowingly put themselves in the path of danger. Causal responsibility can be distributed across many individuals, including the victims of crimes. But the moral responsibility should not be watered down and spread out to include the victims, not even by implication. No more should this be done than a rapist's culpability should be mitigated by pointing out that his victim was drunk or that she was dressed provocatively. Such factors might be causally relevant to explaining who the victim turned out to be, but are irrelevant to who is morally culpable. And whenever moderates harp on about what the victims did to incite or provoke or invite or court disaster, they are, in fact, blaming victims and diluting the culpability of the guilty. They are muddying the moral waters. Whenever they point to such factors, they are inadvertently recommending that we hold ourselves hostage to the delicate sensibilities of religious fanatics who are determined to be outraged. The second tendency that I find very common among moderates is the attempt to sever any causal or explanatory ties between beliefs and atrocious acts committed in the name of a religion. This is typically done by either declaring these actions to be the non-representative actions of a few bad apples, or the result of madness, or classifying them as generic crimes. Indeed, I happen to know someone who is a scientifically informed Catholic and could be described as either a religious moderate or a religious liberal, and who is a staunch opponent of Christian fundamentalism and other forms of fundamentalism, who has suggested that the Charlie Hebdo murders cannot be attributed to the religious beliefs of the men who carried out these murders. Indeed, this person even cited one of my own earlier videos as supportive of that position. That video was entitled Theism, Atheism, and Moral Atrocities, and I'll provide a link for anyone who might be interested in watching it. But here's what this person had to say. Quote, "Calling what happened in Paris execution for blasphemy seems to me to be missing the point. What happened was cold-blooded murder, pure and simple. Have you forgotten that one of the police protection officers was a Muslim? What about the others that died after the initial slaughter? That certainly doesn't fit your execution for blasphemy idea. Don't for a moment think that this was all about execution for blasphemy. This was a bunch of individuals who chose to murder innocent people." End quote. And here's another. Quote, "I refuse point blank to even consider that any terminology other than cold-blooded murder can be used for what was done. I don't care what sort of terminology the perpetrators want to wrap it up in. They can attach whistles and bells and tinsel, but at the end of the day, it was cold-blooded murder." End quote. And lastly, one more quote. Quote, "Those people who support what was done claim it was an execution for blasphemy. And some in this thread," that is the comment thread where this is taking place, "appear to agree with that claim. I refuse to even entertain that. They are using that as an excuse. We need to call it what it was. Cold-blooded murder, pure and simple. Don't let them hide behind excuses." End quote. Now, I think that the effort to suggest that these murders can be divorced from the notion of blasphemy is ludicrous. It's casuistry. And certainly nothing I've ever said or written anywhere should be construed as directly or even indirectly supportive of such an attempt to uncouple religious beliefs from these murders. My view is that the words theism and atheism and polytheism and monotheism and so forth are suitcase terms or umbrella terms into which we can classify or subsume a very broad range of specific religious beliefs. and that the words theism and atheism describe not specific beliefs, but categories of beliefs at the very highest levels, the most abstract levels of generality. But people's actions are motivated by the specific beliefs that they hold, never by such abstract category descriptors. As such, we can't attribute or explain any particular action, be it good or bad, simply by appealing to the fact that someone belongs under the heading of theism or atheism. One doesn't give to charity or steal from a blind man because one is a theist or an atheist. Such actions would have to be motivated by much more specific beliefs within that person's belief set. So, while I would never suggest that the killers in the Charlie Hebdo murders were motivated merely by their theism, I would insist, as I do in that video, that moral or immoral actions can and should be explained by the specific beliefs that people hold, including those held by the Charlie Hebdo murderers. Nothing in my video should be taken as any sort of argument to suggest that we cannot connect these murders to specific religious beliefs. We can. We should. Now, the person that I was quoting seeks to describe the criminal actions at the offices at Charlie Hebdo as, quote, cold-blooded murder. I don't think anyone would disagree, since these crimes were carefully premeditated. But to say that they're cold-blooded murderers in no way militates against or vitiates the observation that these men were motivated by the specific religious beliefs they held. We're not forced to choose between either cold-blooded murder or religiously motivated murder. This was a case of both being true. In fact, these men held to a dangerous strain of Islamic fundamentalism that asserts that depicting Muhammad is blasphemy, and that blasphemy is a just cause for moral outrage, and that those who blaspheme in this way should be punished by death, and that such blasphemies may and should be avenged by ordinary men and women where an Islamic system of justice is not in place to implement such a punishment, and that carrying out such executions is a virtuous act which will be viewed with approval by Allah and possibly bring with it eternal rewards. Remove any one of these beliefs or more from the minds of these men, and the crime would not have taken place. Moreover, these particular men specifically targeted the cartoonists who depicted Muhammad. They knew them by face and by name. They went to the very place where these images were being published to find and kill them there. After doing so, they triumphantly declared that the Prophet Muhammad had been avenged and that Allah is great. Now, if this sort of evidence does not constitute a reason to connect their actions with their beliefs, I submit to you that there can be no action that could ever be connected with any belief. Beliefs, both explicit and implicit, are what motivate our actions from moment to moment. Beliefs are action-guiding mental states. If you get up to go to the refrigerator when you're hungry, it's because you believe that there's food to be found there, that consuming the food therein will satisfy your hunger. If you believed otherwise, that the fridge was empty or that it contained only poisons, you would behave otherwise. Similarly, when in centuries past, Christians in Europe were rounding people up for the crime of witchcraft and burning them, it was because they believed that there existed witches, and they believed that convicted, unrepentant witches were to be forced to confess and killed for the crime of witchcraft. Beliefs matter. Beliefs are operative. If the Bible didn't contain a word about witches, if it did not contain a verse saying, "Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live," it's unlikely that European Christians would have burned women in the tens of thousands for an imaginary crime. Now, we must take care to not blame all Christians for the actions of some Christians. We must not blame all Muslims for the actions of some Muslims. But the very reason we do not blame people on the basis of some broad religious category to which they belong is precisely that we recognize that moderate Christians and Muslims differ in their beliefs from what fundamentalists of these faiths believe. It is indeed the very fact that moderates differ in what they believe that makes them moderates and not fundamentalists. And it's how various fundamentalists differ in their beliefs which makes some fundamentalists quaint and some terribly worrisome. And to recognize this fact is to acknowledge that the specific beliefs people hold, religious or otherwise, are causally relevant and so of explanatory relevance with regards to the actions that people take, including murderous ones. The fact that we can't tar everyone with the same brush in no way implies that a person's religious beliefs have no causal or explanatory role in his or her actions. There is just as much reason to believe that the Charlie Hebdo murders were occasioned by the specific Islamic fundamentalist doctrines that those men held to be true, as there is for believing that Nazi doctrines are relevant to explaining the Holocaust. Beliefs are operative. Beliefs matter. So in summary, when religious moderates, and let me just add here that it's not only religious moderates who do this, but also some secularists, especially those on the political left inclined toward political correctness or who are suffering from liberal guilt who do this. But when moderates seek to distribute the blame so as to include the victims as provocateurs, and thus imply that they had it coming through some sort of moral responsibility on their part, and when they seek to uncouple the actions of those who are actually morally culpable from the beliefs that manifestly motivated them, or try to reclassify them as generic murders, or write them off as the actions of a few madmen or of a few bad apples, they are, in fact, serving as apologists for fundamentalism by denying the obvious fact that what these fanatics held to be true, their metaphysically extravagant beliefs, were relevant contributing factors in explaining why they acted as they did. That's what they're denying. Now, the actions of these people, these murderers, may seem at some superficial level mad, but in light of what they believed, they make perfect sense. These people were not crazy, but they behaved like crazy people because of what they believe. And that is the liability of faith-based reasoning. The discourse of faith is one that, so long as it is preserved and valorized and legitimized, permits perfectly sane people to think and act in ways that would otherwise only be explicable by appeal to madness. One doesn't have to have a defective brain to think and act like a mad person. One just has to have the wrong beliefs in one's head. And that is why it's so important that we not shy away from pointing out that some beliefs are, in fact, pernicious social evils. And whenever religious moderates suggest that such beliefs are not of explanatory relevance, they are providing cover. Beliefs are operative. Beliefs matter. Okay, that's all for now. Thank you for watching, and I hope this helps.